evangelical powerhouses, secret funding, and a campaign to change how you think, vote, and worship. Who's really behind the messaging in your church? Find out coming up on 1819 News, the podcast.
We have an incredible culture here in the state of Alabama, but our politics and public policy don't reflect the people of Alabama. Media drives culture. Culture is what drives politics and public policy.
Welcome, everyone, to 1819 News, the podcast. I'm Bryan Dawson, CEO of 1819 News and host of this here podcast, where we are in pursuit of a free and flourishing Alabama every single week. And I know I always roll and transition from that into saying this is going to be an incredible episode, and they always are. But this one, guys, I've been wanting to do this episode for a very, very long time, and finally have the opportunity, and very, very, very excited to bring on someone who I think has just done unbelievably incredible work in the realm of the culture war. And I'm going to be really diving in the coming weeks about what the culture war is and all these other things. But suffice it to say, there's three institutions that make up everything and what a culture is. There's many others, but the three primary ones are education, media and entertainment, and then the church. Those three institutions play a huge role in the ethos of a nation. And we used to have a Christian ethos in our nation, and that ethos, the reason it's a war is there's people with a competing ethos, a godless, Christ-hating ethos, that are trying to force their worldview upon us by hijacking our institutions. They've taken over education. They've taken over media and entertainment. And what I want to talk to you guys about today is how they are taking over the church and the seminaries and evangelical institutions so that they can force this God-hating, ideology upon us through our churches. It's unbelievable. And so I'm bringing on Megan Basham, who is the culture reporter for the Daily Wire and author of the New York Times bestselling book, Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. Megan, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me, Bryan. And, I have a lot of people who are excited that I'm doing this show because I had a number of friends in Alabama who I actually crossed paths with at John MacArthur's memorial who were like, When are you going to do 1819 News? And I was like, you know what? I got to get on that. You're right. Let's get it on the schedule.
Well, I'm glad. And I think just in God's providence, I think there's a lot going on right now that will make the conversation. Because when the book dropped, you were the most popular person in the world for like 2 months. It was, you were doing interview after interview after interview after interview. And so if people wanted to kind of hear it, it was out there. And I'm kind of leaning on the fact it was God's providence that we're doing this now, because post Charlie Kirk, the stuff that you found makes a lot more sense. Like what we're seeing post Charlie Kirk, as far as, pastors that were like marching in the streets with Black Lives Matter during COVID, pastors that were, moment of silence, a whole hour of silence, whatever it was for George Floyd, complete silence on the assassination of Charlie Kirk.
Yeah.
And so why is that happening? And I just want to tee this up. My audience, again, there's going to be some people in my audience that are super dialed into Reformed evangelical kind of politics and what's going on and who said this and who said that. And there's a bunch of them that aren't. And the biggest thing that I want for my audience to come away from this with is that they need to be vigilant about what's going on in their churches, because there is a very intentional effort to subvert normal Southern Baptist, PCA, whatever churches, to not preach the gospel, but actually undermine the gospel and undermine our nation. So. I guess I'm talking a bunch now, and the goal is to have you talk. So any thoughts on that before I go into kind of my little bit longer introduction, and then I'll let you go?
Yeah. That was really the subject matter of my book. And you mentioned Charlie. He was one of probably the first interviews I did right when it came out, and he immediately got it. He immediately went, okay, so Shepherds for Sale, we're talking about, there's different ways to be for sale. So I'll preface this with with that. But kind of the big headline of the book was that there were many very large, very wealthy secular left institutions that were funneling money into organizations that looked like grassroots efforts, but were actually front groups. They were Astroturf campaigns to try to convince evangelicals that following Jesus requires them to do things like buy into climate alarmism, and so to vote for legislation that would make their gas and their groceries more expensive and give the government more control over, the energy they use. It was groups like the Evangelical Immigration Table, funded by left-wing activists, George Soros' organization specifically. And they were saying that, to follow Jesus, to love your neighbor, to welcome the stranger means that you must support these amnesty bills that are coming up in Congress. And so that was the kind of thing that I covered, was going, okay, people don't realize, and to be quite frank, a lot of times even the lesser known pastors don't realize that they're being worked on and influenced by these left-wing funded influence campaigns. So you may have an average pastor in church. He is a very busy guy. He's not really, thinking about these political issues, but his friend, Mr. Big, nationally famous pastor like Rick Warren or someone, comes to him and says, hey, we've got this group of Christians that's working on this immigration issue. We would love it if you would sign our statement, if you would meet with our local representatives or even our state senator and let them know that you're really with us, that you want to back this amnesty bill. And this pastor, he doesn't know about that. Maybe he signs his name to this statement. And so the idea is to move policy and to use your influence and your vote and your voice as an evangelical, because evangelicals are rightly called, even by left-leaning outlets like The Atlantic, America's most powerful voting bloc. So it's a way to use your churches to try to push progressive policies in government. And so, it was kind of this big network. And for a lot of people, if you were really paying attention, it wasn't necessarily shocking news to you. But for those who are not as dialed in, as you said, it was a shock. They didn't realize where that was coming from. And, they would see things like, why is my pastor pushing Black Lives Matter? Or, why is he insisting that I have white privilege that I need to repent of? Where is this coming from? And so that was really what I started working on, to go, okay, where is this coming from?
Yeah. Well, I think, John MacArthur, the late, great, incredible pastor, just a total gift from God for our generation, said, this may just be the single most important book on modern evangelicalism in recent years. It is bold, clear, and very well researched. And I agree with Johnny Mack, imagine that, on everything but dispensationalism, but then I'd be getting into the weeds if I said that. But I agree with him wholeheartedly here again. And the reason to me that this work that you've done is so important is essentially this, that the communists know the church is the last bastion standing in their way of total domination of the West. The American church is the last man standing, if you will, to keep that kind of picture. The problem is the church doesn't know it. The communist, Marxist, woke, progressive, whatever you want to call them, those people know that the last thing keeping them from having total domination of American culture and politics is the evangelical church, and we don't know it. And you are showing this war that's going on, and there's an old saying that says, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And that's what's going on in our churches, and we have to wake everyone up to the fact that the church is unbelievably powerful. Christ said it is, and that it would be. And we don't realize, I think we take it for granted. And so the work you're doing, uncovering what is actually happening has been, I have to say, like, my blood pressure was raised tremendously as I was reading the book. And here's the book, by the way, just a photo shot of it. As I read through the pages, I had to go and get on Twitter, like, after every chapter and just hammer every single person and, like, I can't believe you did this. Which is, maybe therapeutic on my part, but either way, you'll read it and you'll just be so blown away and disgusted at what's taking place. And specifically, as you see how it goes into the political realm, You have the ERLC, and I'm going to let Megan explain what that is, but essentially the lobbying arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. They know in order to pass this communist immigration legislation, whatever it is, they can't have evangelical resistance. So they kick on this machine within evangelical institutions to start saying things like why, refugee resettlement is actually loving your neighbor. And you see these op-eds and stuff going out all over the place. You're like, what is going on? And because if they can soften up the evangelical stance on these big ticket items politically, then they will be able to go to these legislators that they're lobbying and say, look, Christians actually want refugees. Christians actually want immigrants. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and that was kind of a big part of what I looked into is I took some of these very high profile, and let's be clear, biblically debatable issues. So, there are certain things that I would say, like abortion, like the evil of gender ideology. Biblically, we don't have room to debate about those evils. Bible is very, very clear about where Christians need to stand. Some of these other issues, like what should our immigration policy be, that is debatable. I think it's fair to say that we require assimilation, and how does it help the citizens of the nation who the government is obligated to first see to their needs and their good before it starts seeing to the needs and goods of other people in other countries. So, these are things that we can wrestle with and debate as free citizens in a representative republic. But the problem that you had some of these people like a George Soros, who has been very transparent in his desire to have open borders and to sort of erase national identities. He's talked about that. He's written about that. And one of the things that I laid out in the book was that in around 2012 to 2015, his organization, Open Society, did begin openly talking about, we have a problem with these religious Americans, particularly evangelical Christians, because they are consistently a roadblock for some of the policies and legislation we would like to see get passed. And so what you saw them do, and I'm going to use this as an example since you brought up the ERLC, because it's the same kind of pattern that you see on all of these issues. So what they did with Open Society is they bankroll an organization called the National Immigration Forum. So that's a secular left, openly known secular left organization, not known as Christian, not staffed by Christians. But what they did was they got together with them, they funded that, and they said, well, we will create an evangelical front group. So it will wear an evangelical churchy face. And they created the Evangelical Immigration Table. And they brought in some high profile people to sort of give it a shine of legitimacy and make it seem like, oh gosh, well, okay, I know who Tim Keller is. I know who the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the political lobbying arm of the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S., the Southern Baptist Convention. I know who they are. I know who the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities are. They represent 185 member schools, including schools like Biola, Baylor, Wheaton. So we will get them to come in and sign on to our immigration lobbying efforts. And again, to be very clear, it is funded by leftists. George Soros' own documents later revealed this. And there's no legal separation between the National Immigration Forum and the Evangelical Immigration Table. Legally, they're the same group. Even though they sort of like to, the Evangelical Immigration Table would like for you not to know that is a fact. They're the same group. So you had organizations like the ERLC, Christianity Today, again, Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, lots of high-profile Christians like author Max Lucado, again, Tim Keller, and they were signing these letters, and they continue to do so, demanding action from the government on behalf of evangelicals on immigration. So one of the things they did, for example, was they sent out evangelical immigration Bible studies. So they would send out this material and they would cherry pick verses like welcome the stranger and say that means that we as Christians are obligated to support, for example, that Senator Lankford bill a couple of years ago that evangelicals didn't want, or, even going back further, the John McCain and Chuck Schumer bill of 2015 that once again, evangelicals didn't support. But, part of that effort is to convince your legislators, your Republican legislators that, gosh, I guess I was wrong about what evangelicals like because I'm getting these letters from pastors. I'm meeting with pastors who are telling me that actually their church members do want this. And I would have thought conservatives wouldn't want an amnesty bill, but I don't want to make my evangelical voting base mad, so I guess I better support this. So that's kind of how the game is played. And that's why you see so many of these left-wing organizations willing to spend this money, because they recognize that the evangelical voting bloc is a hurdle for them. They keep running into that wall again and again. So this has been a part of their efforts to kind of try to break down that wall. One, through creating an appearance of a grassroots movement that is false, but also they're trying to take the influence of somebody like a Max Lucado or a Rick Warren or a Tim Keller or a Russell Moore and say, let's get them to take these positions. And then our hope is that their views will trickle down to people in the pews. So your average person in the pews will start to go, well, gosh, I don't really feel like this is good for me and my family, but I want to be a good Christian. I want to follow Jesus faithfully. So I guess I better start backing this. I mean, that's kind of in a nutshell how this works. And what I really want to stress for people is not every pastor is in on it or something like that, but they are probably in a lot of little ways being impacted by it. They're being influenced by it, even if, they're not in the know. They're not one of the people who are at the heads of these organizations, and yet they're still being influenced by it.
Yeah. And some of the evidence that I've seen that is probably the crazy. So you just mentioned Russell Moore, and I'll just kind of tee up a little bit about who he is, and maybe you can add some factoids on him. But Russell Moore used to be at, I don't remember what his position was, but it was Southern, right?
He was initially on faculty at Southern Seminary, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Then he went on to head the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, again, the lobbying arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. So, and then he went over to Christianity Today to be their editor.
That's what I want to talk about is the Russell Moore arc.
Yes.
So when he's at Southern, this guy, so I've got friends, some well-known friends like Eric Kahn and some others that were at Southern, going to seminary there. And Russell Moore was the man. This dude wrote the most bold declaration on Christian patriarchy and biblical patriarchy you've ever heard. He was strong on immigration. He was strong on all of these things. He was literally the man that all the guys, like the man's men, looked up to. And then he got promoted from there and he went to the ERLC. And at the ERLC, he started to just really fade into something that was unrecognizable. And started pushing for basically every single communist political policy initiative. He was going line by line, each itemized thing, whether it was COVID, whether it was immigration, whether it was LGBTQ stuff, whether it was race. It didn't matter what the thing was. You would find him again writing in Christianity Today, writing in the Gospel Coalition articles about the Christian case for communist policy position, or communist policy position is actually loving your neighbor, right? Those are the two that you always see, the Christian case for and how this is actually loving your neighbor, and gets pumped out, and he goes from there, and he did a ton of damage, but in the midst of him doing damage, he was found out, and he was found out because of people like you and people like all these other Twitter influencers, which is just Doug Wilson and all these guys, and the guys in Moscow just lambasted him, and he was literally basically just about kicked. Now he kind of resigned. He doesn't even call himself a Baptist anymore. Leaves being a Baptist along with Beth Moore, no relation. They leave because of them basically being outed for all the stuff they're doing. I don't even know what he identifies as anymore as far as denominationally, and he becomes the editor-in-chief at Christianity Today, which has turned into the laughingstock of evangelicalism. It's the most woke, disgusting, soft, evangelifish publication in Christianity. So what are your thoughts on the long slide or the arc of Russell Moore?
So it's so interesting that you say that, because I have heard the same thing. Now, I didn't really start paying attention to Russell Moore until maybe 2018, 2019. It was really when the big social justice push started to happen. And, like a lot of people, I was just kind of in my little evangelical world. I worked for a Christian magazine. My kids went to a Christian school, and I started seeing this stuff coming in. And so often his name was attached to it. And so I did not know the previous incarnation of Russell Moore that you're talking about. And it was a shock to me to hear, and I've heard it from a lot of people who were his former students, who knew him at that time, and they said he used to be a very conservative man. It's really hard for me to picture now. I mean, I did at one point see an article from him that he wrote arguing that complementarianism was not strong enough. He was arguing for patriarchalism. And that was interesting because you can't even imagine Russell Moore saying something like that today. And so what I can tell you, though, he's an interesting figure because everywhere Russell Moore goes, that left-wing foundation money that I talked about follows. So we saw that with during his tenure at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. At that time, they started taking money from people like the Democracy Fund, which, if you're not familiar with that organization, and I expect most of your viewers and listeners aren't, it was established by Pierre Omidyar. He is the left-wing Buddhist founder of eBay. So not someone that you would look at and expect to be giving money for projects at the Southern Baptist Convention's lobbying arm. But so that he started to give money on, let's research how Christians vote and how evangelicals and Southern Baptists decide how they're going to vote and how they can help foster a more gracious political atmosphere and dialogue with their unbelieving neighbors. Now, I want you to keep in mind, why would these left-wing groups have an interest in that? Because I would argue every time they do that, it's because they want you as Christians to capitulate and to be quiet, because their idea of how we have a gracious dialogue is for you to be less urgent about your political priorities, like saving the lives of unborn babies, like rescuing kids from gender ideology that mutilates their bodies and their minds. So, that's always how this framing of let's have a more gracious dialogue. And so they pay to conduct these studies and to produce these materials, these reports that then go out to, these ordinary Southern Baptist members and to their churches. And so groups like that started paying the ERLC to do that. Another group, the New Age Fetzer Institute, was another organization that did this. So, and of course, the ERLC, as we've already talked about, started during that era, partnering with the Evangelical Immigration Table. So at one point, though, Russell Moore just became, I think, too transparent in his leftism. It wasn't just that he was opposed to Donald Trump. I mean, he became very transparently left on a number of issues. And some of those things that, I have said and said in the book, I don't think you're not a Christian if you don't agree with me on border policies, but that's what they were doing. They were creating an extra biblical, legalistic requirement saying you need to back these policies in order to be faithful to Christ. So it was very Pharisaical. And eventually it became enough that you had ordinary Southern Baptists rebelling, saying you do not get to use our name and our tithes to stake these positions publicly that we don't support. And I think that's very fair. If you are representing a group of people, you do not get to use their influence to pursue something that they don't want pursued. And that's really what he was doing. And so something I write about extensively in the book is that he took something that is a legitimate moral evil, and that is sexual abuse. And he deceitfully and manipulatively took that issue and suggested that it was a massive systemic crisis and that people had sinned and were covering up abuse. And I looked deeply into it, and that simply wasn't the case. Obviously in individual churches, abuse has happened, and we don't want to minimize that. And, it should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. It should be investigated to the full extent of the law. But what he was doing was using that issue to suggest that some other leadership within the Southern Baptist Convention, the conservatives, were covering up abuse, when in fact, there's not a shred of evidence that they did. And so he did some things like leak letters. I would say they were not leaked. I'd say they were strategically sent to places like Religion News Service, the Washington Post, and other left-leaning media outlets to suggest that he was a hero fighting against all of these conservatives in the Southern Baptist Convention. And he threw this bomb. It was very effective. And then he kind of left at that point because he had severed all ties and trust within the Southern Baptist Convention. And then he went over to Christianity Today, because I think at that point he had to go somewhere that was much more overtly progressive to have any legitimacy at all, because no conservative organization is going to want a Russell Moore at that point. And, for those who don't know just how progressive and left-wing Christianity today has become, some of the other things that I cover in the book and have covered since the book came out, there was some new information. Things like I looked at the political donations of Christianity Today's staff from right before Donald Trump came on the scene to right before, at that point, before my book came out, the 2024, the previous election, so the 2021 election, every single donation had gone to Democrats. And that included from their editor who was covering news and politics was making donations to Democrats at the same time that he was heading up their coverage of news and politics and, doing interviews with political figures. Another story that I just recently covered, this was just within the last couple of weeks, is talking about that money again. I uncovered that Christianity Today has taken over $1 million from the Hewlett Foundation, which, if you are not familiar with them, it's one of the largest funders of abortion in the country. They are the second largest private funder of Planned Parenthood. So we are talking about extremely left-wing people who do not in any way have views that align with biblical morality.
If you're running a ministry or you own a business, my guess is that you've been thinking about starting a podcast for a while now, but for various reasons it hasn't happened yet. Send me an email. I need to personally connect you with Yonder Child Media. They built this studio in 2 days and tackle all of the production. I just come in, start talking, and leave. It's that easy. They do everything else. Whether you want to record at your business or a home office like they just built for me, you come in, start talking, and Yonder Child will do everything else. Send me an email. That's going to be Bryan, Bryan.Dawson, Dawson, at 1819news.com, and I'd be happy to personally connect you. A pattern I see develop is whatever left-wing progressive issues, and it's all very Machiavellian, right? And we're not political. Left-wing political policy issues, they're actually gospel issues. And conservative issues is we don't actually talk about that in church because that's political. But left-wing issues, they're actually gospel issues, and that's all we talk about.
Right.
But your issues, actually, it's you can't talk about that. Will church discipline you if you talk about it? It's like, it's crazy. One last point on Russell Moore before I transition, and I'm going to see in post-production if I can have Adrian put this on there. It's just, it's the peak performance of Russell Moore was when he was obviously, in my opinion, that's what I have to say so I don't get sued, probably getting paid to promote vaccinations. He had 2 masks on in his car, and the outside mask was like a Lord of the Rings kind of animation mask. It said, "This little hobbit just got vaccinated," and it has his vaccine card. The gayest thing I've ever seen in my entire life was that, and it was Russell Moore trying to get you to get the death shot. But anyway,
and I'll tell you, that was how this book came to be, was I started covering how people like
that
Russell
was going to be
Moore,
my transition. Yes. Yep.
So anyway, the book came to be because I started covering why are all of these evangelical organizations and high profile figures suggesting that we must get this vaccine to be obedient to Jesus. I mean, it was just appalling. So that was kind of my first breakthrough on this subject matter.
Well, that was going to be my next transition I mean, we could literally, I wish I had like a Joe Rogan time slot here and we could just go for 3 hours. Because you went through in your book, you went through every single one of these issues from immigration. It starts with race. It opens with a very touching kind of horrible kind of story about race, but you got into this, you discovered this pattern, and it's like you kind of figured out the glasses that you can look and kind of see, oh, this is what's going on through COVID, and then you took those same glasses and looked at every other issue, and you saw they were running the same play in every kind of progressive thing. Talk about like the Francis Collins and COVID and basically how you came into this whole thing. Well,
and if I can, insert my personal story here a little bit,
Please.
This was really how I started reporting on these issues. As I said before, I was at a Christian magazine, and there was certainly on a personal level some wrestling with it. I was at World Magazine, and let me preface this. I always want to say some of the woke left-wing reporters that I was butting heads with over how we were going to cover COVID, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, they have all left and actually gone to either Christianity Today, and a couple went over to the Dispatch, which, if you're not familiar, was kind of where David French landed when he left National Review. And David French is he's now a columnist for the New York Times, but he is somebody who has become very progressive. He is now pro gay marriage as a legal matter. He uses transgender pronouns, things like that. So someone who has become markedly left wing. But at that time in 2019, 2020, as these two twin issues, I would say, of social justice and COVID were happening, there was just a huge wrestling within these organizations, these Christian organizations that were in my life. So first, I had people at the magazine, other reporters, constantly just pelting me with angry emails and things if I did something like interview Vodi Bakum, who, the pastor who wrote Fault Lines, recently passed away, just a giant of the faith, because he was tackling social justice. So that was happening on one side. And then we were at a church where suddenly I got an email from our children's ministry director about how we could talk to our kids about their white privilege. And that for me was just, that was a moment that slapped me upside the head that went, what is happening in the church? And it was because of those things and my inability, it felt like, to cover them in the way that I wanted to cover them within evangelicalism, that I ended up leaving and going over to the Daily Wire. And I love World. And look, that is one of the few organizations that I would say fought the woke wars and won. I never want to confuse people. I'm like, they do wonderful work over there still. But it was tense there for a while before some of those people left. So at that point, though, I went over to the Daily Wire and started, like you said, I started seeing things through a new lens, because I went, what is going on in my own church, in my own, kids' Christian school? And about that time is when the pandemic hit. And suddenly I see Francis Collins, who at that time was the head of the National Institutes of Health, and that essentially made him Anthony Fauci's boss. So he was being platformed as this strong evangelical Christian in the halls of power. And he was a great scientific mind, and he was going to tell us what was going on with the pandemic, and he was going to speak to us Christian to Christian. And this was how he was presented in interviews with Rick Warren, with Tim Keller, with Christianity Today and Russell Moore, with the ERLC. And it was just bam, 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 one right after another. And in each of these interviews, I was waiting for one of these Christian journalists or pundits to ask him, why do you support the LGBTQ movement? Why did you, if you are a Christian, start an initiative to fund research into supposedly queer children, for example? Why did you fund abortion research that included things like grafting the aborted scalps of babies onto lab rats? Why did you fight the Trump administration to continue research into aborted baby parts when the Trump administration was saying, we actually think this is immoral and we're going to stop it? And you, the supposed Christian, were the one fighting for those initiatives. Nobody asked him. And I knew this about him. So I was sitting there going, what is happening that they are holding this man out as a faithful Christian? And then there was the substance of these interviews. Another thing that became clear pretty quickly was that he and Anthony Fauci were not being honest with us about the origins of the virus, that it was very possible that it did come out of a Wuhan lab. And yet Christianity Today was giving Francis Collins a platform to tell Christians that you were sinning if you asked questions about where that virus came from, that was to engage in conspiracy and to be conspiracy minded and to slander brothers and sisters. If you asked that very reasonable question about going, well, wait a minute, we're funding gain of function research in a Wuhan lab, and it came out right there in Wuhan, and you're telling us that it had nothing to do with that? They were trying to spiritually gaslight you into not asking that question. And so I was just sitting there going, this is insane that nobody's talking about this. And there were other things, like he started this Love Your Neighbor, Get the Shot campaign that all of these evangelical luminaries signed and promoted, basically saying, maybe you're a young woman of childbearing age and you're not so sure what this experimental vaccine might do to you. But if you're going to love Jesus, if you're going to love your neighbor, you better get that vaccine. And it was just appalling to me. I went, this is legalism. This should be a matter of of conscience. We should all have liberty to decide whether or not we're comfortable getting this vaccine. And so I'm sitting at home as at that point a very new journalist for the Daily Wire. I had not been there that long, and I actually, without telling anyone, started writing about it. I started writing about who Francis Collins is, how they were manipulating Christians, how no one was asking questions, how, the legalism that I was seeing. And I wrote this very long, maybe 3,500 word article. And at that point, I didn't even tell my editors that I was working on it. It was something I was doing quietly in my own time. And I gave it to my editor in chief when I was finished. And he was like, wow, okay, well, I don't know if we want to attack pastors. We need to, fact check this very carefully.
Yeah.
Let us think about this. Excuse me. So it ended up sitting on our CEO's desk for maybe a week, few days. And then he came to me and went, you know what? Yep, this is news. We're going to publish it. And that was kind of when everything broke open for me. It went viral and a publisher got in touch with me and said, is there more? Could this be a book?
Yeah. It's just, that's how I discovered you, as that first Daily Wire article on all of this. And I didn't know who you were. I'd never heard of you. And I read that. And again, like I said, this is not, me blowing smoke or whatever. This is it. Like uncovering the subversion of the American church. The American church is the last thing standing in the way of complete progressive leftist woke dominance. And to be able to show with receipts so crystal, bring such crystal clarity to what's happening. I mean, the amount of people it's happening in like waves. So like your Daily Wire article woke a ton of people up. And then your book, woke a ton of people up. And then it's just like you're starting to just kind of see it more and more and more. And I'm hoping that it will just continue and it will reach a critical mass. And but there's this other thing, and I don't know if we can spend our last few minutes talking about this, because I had one question I wanted to ask as it pertained about Christian leaders, because we lost John MacArthur and we lost Vodi Bakum. I'm going to put these two kind of together into one question. The problem that I see in evangelicalism is that the men who are behind the pulpits are disqualified either biblically or just from the spirit of fear and cowardice. They do not possess the courage that's required to get behind the pulpit and preach the truth in a world of lies, which is dangerous business. They don't have the courage to do that, and they find themselves like, well, what do I do? And that's where those institutions come in and say, well, you tell them to get the shot because that's loving their neighbor, to get the refugees because that's loving your neighbor. And that's how they're manipulated by this stuff, is because they're cowards. Who are the evangelical leaders of the future? We lost Charlie Kirk. He would have been one definitely on that list. And what I love about what specifically Charlie and Vodi were so good at this is their politics wove right into their theology, and their theology fed into their politics. They could be talking in one stream of consciousness, and you wouldn't know if they were talking about politics or theology because it was both. Yeah, the answer is yes, right? Like, which one were they talking about? Yes. So who do you see as kind of the rising leaders in evangelicalism? You can never replace those men, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's been a devastating few months. John MacArthur, as you said, we knew that he was kind of reaching the end of his faithful service. But Charlie Kirk was a shock. Vodi Bakum was a shock.
Yep.
But yes, the good news is that, there's kind of two groups. There's guys who I think have been sort of waiting in the wings, and they've been where you're talking about. They're brave, they're courageous, they're faithful, and they've been sidelined because they were so bold that you had people kind of going, oh, I don't know about that guy.
I'm friends with all those guys. Yeah.
Right. I mean, my buddy Chase Davis, I love him. I think he's doing tremendous work.
Love him.
And then there'll be a lot that people may not know yet. I did an interview about John MacArthur with Johnny Artavanus. I don't know if you know him, out of Nashville. He's a young pastor. He's had some clips kind of go viral recently of his preaching. People have sort of clipped his preaching and they've started to go viral. And I don't know how old he is, but gosh, he's can't be more than his mid-30s. And I listen to his preaching and it's so powerful and faithful. And he's very, very reminiscent of MacArthur.
Okay.
And he's in Nashville. And I just go, wow, that guy's great. Joe Rigney. Anyone who knows me knows I'm a very big Joe Rigney fan. I put his books and his podcast interviews in everyone's hands. You mentioned Doug Wilson. I'm a Doug Wilson fan.
Yes.
I especially like his cultural commentary. I think there is almost no one doing as incisive Christian culture commentary as Doug Wilson is. So I love him. I love my own pastor who's not famous, Chris Justice. And I think that is key, is that there are a lot of these younger guys. Michael Foster, I think, is doing great work in the sphere of, it's good to be a man, and talking about male headship and leadership. And so there's just so many of them. And that's one of the things I want to encourage people is there's a lot of those guys who are already out there that your big evangelicalism, big Eva, the institutions would have deemed too hot to touch before. And now those guys are having a moment and people are suddenly willing to hear them out. Amen. And so I think that's great. And then you have some other guys, and I'm watching them because they're interesting to me. They're guys who I would have deemed squishy before.
Yeah.
They would have used the language of the quote unquote third way, which is, the gospel is neither right nor left, but, we don't talk about these issues because we don't want to put obstacles in people's way of coming to Christ, even though they're biblical. We're still not going to talk about it too much. And I have seen some of those guys, and it seems sincere, and I won't name them so that I'm not, slamming guys who I think have sincerely started to reconsider the road they were on. And they, particularly after Charlie's death, I'm seeing that. And they're going, you know what? I had it wrong before. And so they are becoming more bold.
Amen.
And so, I'm seeing a lot of those too. And that's cheering to me. And even in some of the cases, because, I get it. Some people are like, well, where was this guy when the fight was hot? Why wasn't he? And I get that feeling, but I also want to say, hey, we got to take it as a win. The fact that the Overton has moved, and even if some of them insincerely feel like they need to get into the middle of that Overton, that's still a good thing. Let's praise God for it.
And a lot of the kind of hard right guys that I would include myself in on that, like, we welcome those guys. Like, if we see them genuinely repent and they weren't there for the heat of the fight, they will be in the next one. We welcome them. I don't see anybody pushing them back. I think a good summary for me, I posted recently on Facebook and Twitter, or X, and said, Bryan, because people always ask me, who should I listen to? Who should I, whatever. It's like, succinctly describe what you believe your theology is on life, politics, culture, faith, family, whatever. And it was the picture of Doug Wilson and Vodi Bakum being interviewed by Joe Rigney. And it's just them laughing and cracking up. And that's it. Vodi Bakum and Doug Wilson. That's this. So, well, that's awesome.
And Phil Johnson. I'd be remiss if I didn't. Because, I'll go and find his preaching and Sinclair Ferguson's preaching. And, so us to listen to the old guard too.
Amen.
Because those were the guys who fought, right? They were faithful and they stood.
For decades.
Yeah.
4 decades. Amen. And then the Charlie Kirk Memorial was the most unbelievable thing I've ever seen. And I know we got to wrap it up, but wow. So, yeah. So, all right.
Absolutely. Yeah. I wish I could have been there. I had surgery and had to miss it, but, it was powerful. And I really do look at Charlie's death and go, it is a picture of the blood of the martyrs being the seed of the church. Because I don't know about you, but I could tell it, a dozen little quiet stories of what's just happening in our own community of people watching that and coming to church and coming to faith and reaching out to my husband and I and going, hey, could we come to church with you? And we're hearing great stories like that all over.
Amen. That's incredible. Megan Basham, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And then where can people find your books? Just on Amazon? I'll get a good square picture of it there.
Yeah. Amazon, probably Target. I think anywhere they have books, you can find it. So.
All right. And your handle on Twitter?
At Meg Basham. And just know I'm a little spicy there, so be prepared.
It's awesome. You guys, go follow her. Megan, again, thank you so much for your time. And to my audience, as always, until next time, put your trust in God and keep your powder dry.